Chapter 43, The Aborigines, Section 2. The party dispatched from Sydney to take possession of the island, and who landed in August, on their arrival at Risdon, saw nothing of the natives. A solitary savage, armed with a spear, afterwards entered the camp and was cordially greeted. He accepted the trinkets which they offered, but he looked on the novelties scattered about without betraying surprise. By his gestures, they inferred that he discharged them from their trespass. He then turned towards the woods, and when they attempted to follow, he placed himself in the attitude of menace and poised his spear. On the 3rd of May, 1804, during the absence of Lieutenant Bowen, the officer in command, the first severe collision occurred. 500 blacks, supposed to belong to the Oyster Bay tribe, gathered on the hills which overlooked the camp. Their presence occasioned alarm, and the convicts and soldiers were drawn up to oppose them. A discharge of firearms threw them into momentary panic, but they soon reunited. A second of ball cartridge brought down many. The rest fled in terror and were pursued. It is conjectured that 50 fell. The accounts of this affair differ greatly. By one party, they are said to have assailed a man and woman living in advance of the camp, and to have burned their hut. William White, who saw them earliest and gave notice of their approach, declared they then exhibited no hostility, and were not near the hut before the collision. They came down in a semicircle, carrying waddies but not spears. A flock of kangaroo hemmed in between them. The women and children attended them. They came singing and bearing branches of trees. This curvilinear mode of marching was noticed by Labillardière. They probably assembled for a corroboree. "They looked at me," said the witness, "with all their eye." But they did not attempt to molest him. For the British, it may be alleged that customs, afterwards understood, were then less known. They were ignorant of the language and temper of the blacks, and the preservation of the settlement was the first military duty of Lieutenant Moore, who directed the fire. The action was sudden, and perhaps no statement is exact. The natives were provoked by the occupation of their common place of resort, and it is no discredit to their character if even they attempted to expel the intruders. A current report respecting a conflict on the site of the hospital at Hobart Town received a curious exposition from the Reverend Mr. Knopwood. It was a tradition that a party of blacks assembled there were dispersed by a volley of grape-shot, and that several fell. Human bones and grape-shot were found, but the reverend gentleman stated that the bones were the remains of persons who came from India and who were buried there, and that the shot were accidentally dropped when the stores once kept there were removed. The consequences of these events were lamentable. The losses of the natives in their ordinary warfare rarely extended beyond 2 or 3, but the havoc of their new enemy awakened irremediable distrust. The sorrows of a savage are transient. Not so his resentment. Every wrong is new until it is revenged, and there is no reason to suppose these terrible sacrifices were ever forgotten. In these collisions, no British subject had fallen, but in the succeeding year, 1805, a prisoner of the Crown was speared while following a kangaroo, and 2 years after 1807 another, named Mundy, met with a similar fate. The black had received presents from his hands, and approaching him in pretended amity, trailed between his toes the fatal spear. These facts are given to illustrate the cruelty of the natives, and it may be presumed that, from the slaughter of Risdon, not many could be added to the number. These were, however, the acts of individuals, and without concert or much premeditation. It is conjectured that the first European who perished was Monge, the surgeon of the geography, in 1802. The attack was unprovoked, and it is said unavenged. The scarcity of food compelled the British to adopt a mode of life somewhat resembling that of the Aborigines. Germain, a marine, was employed from 1805 to 1810 in procuring kangaroo, which he hunted with dogs. He but rarely carried a gun, slept on the ground in the summer, and in the winter on the branches of trees. During his wanderings, he often encountered the natives, but they offered no violence, and he stated, as the result of his experience, that until bushrangers excited them by cruelties, there was no harm in them. The daughter of a settler of 1804 was left sometimes in their care. Their kindness was among the recollections of her childhood. The prisoners were dispersed. The government, unable to supply the common necessaries of life, gave them license to forage. Labour could not be exacted, nor discipline enforced, and when circumstances altered, it was difficult to recall the wanderers, or to recover authority so long relaxed. In their intercourse with the natives, licentious and cruel outlaws committed every species of atrocity which could be suffered by the weak in contact with the wicked. Lord Hobart, under whose auspices the colony was planted, directed the lieutenant governor to conciliate the natives, to preserve them from oppression, and to encourage them to resort for protection to his authority. Their natural rights were recognized, but unhappily no provision was made to define their interest in the soil of their country. Their migratory habits were unfavorable to official supervision, and the success of humane suggestions depended on the doubtful concurrence of ignorant cotters and wandering shepherds. In 1810, an order was issued by Governor Collins, forcibly describing the wrongs of the natives and the revenge to which they were prompted. They had pursued an officer residing at Herdsman's Cove, and failing to capture him, they fired his premises. 2 persons, George Getley and William Russell, had disappeared. It was supposed the victims of resentment, awakened by the abominable cruelties and murders, such is the language of Collins, perpetrated by the white people. This Russell was himself notorious for skill in their torture, the subject of his boast. The government declared that persons who wantonly fired on the natives, or murdered them in cold blood, should suffer the last penalties of the law. The official treatment of the Aborigines was not always judicious or calculated to impress the whites with the notion of civil equality. A native, whom it was deemed desirable to detain, was fettered by Colonel Collins. Notwithstanding, he escaped and was seen long after with the iron on his leg. Nor can the punishments inflicted for crimes committed against the blacks, unusual as those punishments were, be given in proof that both races were valued alike. It is not, however, true that cruelty was always unpunished. A man was severely flogged for exposing the ears of a boy he had mutilated, and another for cutting off the little finger of a native and using it as a tobacco stopper. The natives continued to shun the settlement for many years, but their confidence was easily renewed by gentle treatment. It was, however, capricious, or more probably it was soon shaken by insult, unknown to all but themselves. It was desired by Colonel Davy to establish a friendly intercourse, and he instructed the men to invite the tribes they might encounter. A servant of this governor, employed at South Arm, suddenly came on a tribe of 36 persons. A native woman, living with a white, willingly went forth to communicate the wishes of the governor. They consented to visit Hobart Town, to which they were transferred by water. Davy endeavoured to win their confidence, and they remained about town for weeks. Having received some offence from worthless Europeans, they retreated to their woods and never returned. This party attempted to reach Bruny Island, and all were drowned, except one woman. Mr. Knopwood remembered that, in 1813 and 1814, the natives were fed at his door. A number of children were forcibly taken from them, and they disappeared from the camp. Colonel Davy bears witness to the continuance of cruelty, which he censured in the strongest language of indignation. Certain settlers established a species of juvenile slavery. They followed up the mother, retarded by the encumbrance of her children, until she was compelled in her terror to leave them. Well might the governor declare that crime so enormous had fixed a lasting stigma on the British name. These provocations produced their usual consequences. By spearing cattle and other acts of hostility, a tribe at the Coal River revenged the robbery of their children. Surely a slight retaliation for such incredible wickedness. An expedition to Macquarie Harbour in 1817 discovered a tribe hitherto unknown. They received the first visit with the usual friendliness, a feeling which was, however, of short duration. The Oyster Bay tribe are mentioned. They had begun to exhibit that spirit of hostility which made them a terror to the colony and armed the entire community against them. They had speared one man and killed another. But the origin of this feeling is distinctly stated. A native had been shot in an expedition to capture some Aboriginal children. Sorel prolongs the testimony that tells so mournfully on behalf of the natives. He speaks of firing on the blacks as a habit. That child stealing was practiced in the remoter districts. That settlers had adopted groundless prejudices against the unfortunate people as alike incapable and unworthy of conciliation. that they offered no serious discountenance to the cruelty of their servants. Thus, several whites had perished, and cattle had been speared in revenge. He reminded the colonists that, as their flocks increased and the shepherds extended their range, this obvious method of retaliation, then rarely adopted, would multiply the loss both of property and human life. The danger was proved by examples. In 1819, a collision occurred. A man on each side killed, and cattle and sheep were speared. But the account continues, the stock keepers detained and maltreated the wife of a chief. Either on this or some such occasion, they were pursued by a party of the 48th Regiment, and 17 were slain. He maintains very strenuously the opinion of his predecessors that the Aborigines were not often the aggressors, and that the injuries they inflicted were committed under the impulse of recent provocation. Sorel provided for the native children, except those committed to private hands by their parents or retained with the express sanction of himself. There is no reason to doubt that several of these were orphans and adopted and reared with the utmost humanity. Among the expenses of the times, it is gratifying to observe one item in the rental of a house for the entertainment of the Aborigines. The sentiments of Governor Sorel are honourable to his character and cannot be doubted. But we are startled to find that when charges so solemnly imputed must have been founded upon particular facts, no equal punishment seems to have overtaken the crimes proclaimed. The government disapproved of oppression, but it was either too weak or too indolent to visit the guilty. Mr. Commissioner Beag, who came to the colony 1820 in his voluminous reports, rarely alludes to the natives of these seas. Those of Van Diemen's Land engaged a very small share of his attention, and in 2 brief paragraphs he describes their character and disposes of their claims. He remarks that an act of unjustifiable hostility had awakened their resentment, passes over an interval of 16 years, and expresses his conviction that no obstacle they could oppose to colonization need excite alarm. It is probable that his instructions would but briefly touch on questions relating to these children of the soil, but considering that the notices and orders of government must have apprised him of their sufferings, he dismisses their case with astonishing indifference. Several Wesleyan missionaries visited this island during the years 1821 and 1822. The natives attracted their notice. They described with brevity their moral and social state, but they did not intimate the smallest apprehension of their malice. For several years, reference to the Aborigines is of rare occurrence. The year preceding the first series of outrages furnished no incident worth contemporary record. We are reminded, however, that they survived by an act of equestrian audacity. Mr. Risley, looking down Allen Vale, saw a naked girl dashing off at full speed on a valuable horse which she bridled by the tether, the first of her race ever known to gallop. Horsemen pursued her for 2 days without overtaking her. In those numerous publications which precede 1824, the Aborigines are always represented as originally friendly and only dangerous when excited by cruelty. It was the boast of the times that the whole island could be crossed in safety by 2 persons armed with muskets, and Kerr, who wrote latest, does not even mention their existence. It is difficult to imagine more decided proof that at this time the depredations of the blacks were neither numerous nor sanguinary. It is the general opinion, however, that the remonstrances of Sorel had been attended with some success, and that the settlers and stock-keepers were not unimpressed with his predictions of a more concerted and continuous revenge. Nor can we doubt that many persons of humanity even exaggerated this peril to restrain those brutal natures which are sensible only of personal risk. Footnotes: the natives, who have been rendered desperate by the cruelties they have experienced from our people, have now begun to distress us by attacking our cattle. 2 were lately wounded by them at Collinsvale, and 3, it is reported, belonging to George Guest, have been killed at Blackman's Bay. As this tribe of natives have hitherto been considered friendly, the change in their conduct must be occasioned by some outrage on our part. No account having been received up to this time of William Russell and George Getley, there can be no doubt of the miserable death they have been put to. This unfortunate man, Russell, is a striking instance of divine agency, which has overtaken him at last, and punished him by the hands of those very people who have suffered so much from him. he being well known to have exercised his barbarous disposition in murdering or torturing any who unfortunately came within his reach. The Derwent Star, January 29, 1810. From the conduct of the native people, when free from any feeling of injury towards those who have held intercourse with them, there is strong reason to hope that they might be conciliated. On the northeastern coast, where boats occasionally touch, and at Macquarie Harbour, where the natives have been lately seen, they have been found inoffensive and peaceable, and they are known to be equally inoffensive, where the stock-keepers treat them with mildness. March 19, 1819. Jewel, mentioned by Bigger, was transported from Sydney for chopping off the right arm of his wife. He said she should make no more doughboy. The whites persuaded the natives that the lighter hue of their half-caste children resulted from the too free use of flour. End of chapter 43, being the Aborigines. Section 2.